Are the majority of Canadians better off or worse off even after you factor in the rebate?
Well, once you factor in the rebate, but also the economic impacts, based on our modeling, the majority of households will see a negative impact as a result of the carbon tax.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you so much again for being here, Monsieur Giroux. Of course, we're incredibly disappointed to see that the amount put forward by the government is $7 billion more, even than we had anticipated in terms of their planned deficit. I mean, as we've seen with them, this is a trend that the numbers start at a certain level, they get worse and they get worse and they get worse, as we've seen with ArriveCan. In your report on refocusing government spending, you stated that $500 million was planned to reduce in consulting, other professional services, and travel. $350 million was from professional services. Did this include a decrease in consulting costs? Because, of course, we've seen with ArriveCan that this government loves its relationship with consultants, with liberal insiders, and consulting costs under this government continue to balloon. So did that include a decrease in consulting services, please?
So the refocusing government spending, the $500 million in savings for the fiscal year that is ending this year, is $150 million coming from travel services, a reduction in travel expenditures, and the remainder, so $350 million, is expected to come from a reduction in consulting services. These amounts have already been frozen by the Treasury Board, so departments cannot access them. We asked for details on these expenditures, and we find that for a significant portion of them, these will indeed be reduction in consulting services, even though for some departments there were no details provided because the reductions will come from general expenditures. So it's difficult to be absolutely certain that the totality of the 350 will be a reduction indeed in consulting services.
Right. In reviewing your report, it actually seemed to me, and having been a public servant in charge of cost centers, I have a good understanding of them. It does seem like for two major areas, both defense and Indigenous services, either funds that were in a reserve or which were just going to be given back anyway. So in my opinion, the Treasury Board President certainly has failed on her objective, which she set for herself back in July or August, I believe that it was, this past summer. Now, the Office of the Privy Council found $1.3 million by streamlining management structures, but from the recent ArriveCan study, it seems that management is too complex to ensure accountability and compliance through the system. That has led to significant cost overruns and astronomical, actually, we've seen at ArriveCan. Do you think that all departments should begin looking at streamlining management and services to be more efficient and to ensure that there are cost savings in the organization and in outcomes? What would you recommend based upon what you've seen both within your reporting and with the ArriveCan scam scandal?
Well, when it comes to management in the public service, some of you may know that there are executive class executives in the executive group. There's 5 levels, so from EX1 to EX5. And in addition to that, there's deputy ministers, including associate deputy ministers. So it's not uncommon for departments to have 5 levels of executives, an associate deputy minister or more, and 1 deputy minister. So it leads to a situation where an employee can have 7 levels of management above them, from EX1 to 5, an associate deputy minister and a deputy minister. So there is certainly room for delayering, as some would say, and it's something that was considered many years ago in the public service, where some EX classifications would be collapsed, leading to a situation where there would be 3 layers of executives as opposed to 5, which can have its own drawbacks by adding to the approval process and also leading to many other issues. So the short answer to your question is yes, there's room to reduce some levels of executives in the public service.
And again, I think that's evidenced by our longtime inability to determine who approved GC strategies because of the several layers. And as well, as we've seen, this gives the ability for different levels of management to blame each other. And so I think it definitely would improve accountability. Further to your question. My last question with my time is, throughout the ArriveCan scam study, we've seen that there is significant missing documentation. Have you encountered this when you've been completing your studies as in your role as head of the PBO?
We don't have the same role. I don't have the same role as the Auditor General. So I don't always need to have the same level of documentation as the AG. In general, I found that the information that we need has been provided by government departments. And as I said, we don't have the same mandate, so we don't require the same level of proof. But in general, we have not had major issues in getting documents that we need for the purpose of the types of reports that we have been preparing for the benefit of parliamentarians.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from your reports consistently and through your evaluation is, I think, what we've concluded on this side of the table, and that is that the problems that we're seeing in ArriveScan are endemic throughout government. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Giroux, and to your colleagues for joining us today. The recent Auditor General's report on the ArriveCan scam found that it was extremely difficult to follow the money, and that Canadians, in her estimation, did not receive value for the money spent. We have the Procurement Ombudsman's reporting on an extreme lack of documentation throughout the procurement process, and on interesting practices like bait and switch. In your role as the Parliamentary Budget Officer, it is, your role to provide Parliament with the analysis not only on macroeconomic and fiscal policy, but also to help us in raising the quality of parliamentary debate and promoting greater transparency and accountability. And I certainly do appreciate the role that you play. As numerous investigations are undertaken and reports and audits continue to be tabled, what concerns you the most about the spending of this current government?
That's a broad question. I'd say what concerns me the most is the disconnect between the increased level of spending, which is a policy choice, but the disconnect between this and the performance indicators that don't seem to be markedly improving. So departments and organizations have to adhere to performance indicators. So they determine which indicators they'll be following, and they also determine the targets that they aim for. So over time, we've seen an increase in the number of public servants in public expenditures, but year after year, despite the fact that departments choose their performance indicators and the targets, they don't seem to be getting significantly better at reaching them. And I've used the analogy before with some of your colleagues that it's as if you ask the students, the students determine the topic of the test as well as the pass mark, but a portion of them still fail. And that's what worries me with the increased level of spending. So we increase spending, and as taxpayers, we provide more resources. But despite that fact, there are some sectors in the public service that are doing great, but others that seem to be trailing behind, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I have to believe that you're also concerned with the amount of debt that the government is serving at this time. In your report, you mentioned that there is an increase of $3.2 billion in interest payments on unmatured debt, and I'm really interested in that. For this past fiscal year, this means that total interest payments on unmatured debt will reach $36.8 billion, and that came from your report. in that report, you also specifically refer to total interest payments on unmatured debt. My understanding is that unmatured debt is essentially debt that is not yet due. Is that correct?
Yes, but it's also excluding some other interest-bearing obligations, such as the obligations the government has towards the public pensions, the pensions of public servants. So the interest on the debt is what really matters, and it's expected to be $46.5 billion this year.
Yeah, so you kind of beat me to my next question, which was, are there further interest payments that the government is paying on matured debt, which is not included in the $36.8 billion number that you have cited?
Yes, so as I mentioned, interest on the unmet obligations or the obligations of the government towards pension plans of its employees also adds to interest on unmatured debt. So the debt servicing costs are what really matters, and they're expected to reach $46 billion, and 46.5, I think, this year.
Mr. Jim,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Giroux, for your excellent work. My colleagues asked some important questions about the government's Arrive scam scandal and the costs associated with that. When talking to people about this scandal who are involved in government, one point of feedback I often get is this is just the tip of the iceberg. People see the ballooning of contracting out, the number of firms involved in so-called staff augmentation and middlemen. I wonder if you could help us get a sense of the magnitude of contracting out in general. And I'll ask some specific questions related to pieces of that. But how much are we spending in a given year on contracting out functions of public service delivery?
So to give you an order of magnitude, we estimate that there's about $21 billion in contracting out. So that includes, obviously, consultant fees, consultant services, but it also includes assistance or professional services that are not available in the public service. For example, if you're building warships, you don't necessarily expect the expertise, all of the expertise, to be available at the Department of National Defense.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I was thinking through kind of what are the instances of contracting out that maybe seem more plausible and legitimate, and the ones that seem less plausible and legitimate. So the typology I came up with is let's put it in three buckets. Let's say hard tasks, so specific hard tasks that the government says we just don't have people who know how to do that within government. That's one bucket. And then another bucket might be management consulting. So the work this committee has done on McKinsey, for example, where people are brought in to offer general advice on direction, management consulting. And then the third would be pure middlemen, so people who are hired to hire other people, like GC Strategies. So within that $21 billion in contracting out, could you try to give us a sense of the magnitude of each bucket?
So looking at what you laid out in terms of categories, I'd say the vast majority are probably what one would describe as hard tasks. For example, the expertise that the public service doesn't have, or services that are needed to contract out to provide health services to remote First Nations communities. Consulting services would probably be much lower, $1 billion or $2 billion. I don't know the exact numbers. And the pure middlemen.
And I'll just jump in, and we can go back and forth. Sure. I mean, $1 billion or $2 billion is smaller than the total of $21 billion, but $1 billion or $2 billion is still a lot of money. So can you give us a sense, of when you say a lower proportion, what kinds of amounts we'd be talking about for those management consulting and those middleman kind of buckets?
So the management consulting or the consulting services, we have done a report that indicated the broad categories, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but what I remember is it was about 10% of the overall total, maybe less. And the pure middlemen, there was no such category because they could be embedded in all of these categories if, for example, somebody who wins a contract then turns around and contract subcontracted to somebody else. So it's very difficult to figure out the proportion that would be pure middlemen, as you name that category.
And I guess this speaks to the lack of proper records, right? So with the Arrive scam issue specifically, the Auditor General's estimate is we're looking at close to $20 billion went to GC Strategies. They didn't apply any hard skills. We have, I think, close to $8 billion went to Dalian. That's already half of the total, and those are areas where we know there were no hard skills applied. So I guess to summarize what you said, this government is spending about $21 billion in contracting out, $2.1 billion of which is going to that kind of management consulting category, and the middlemen category is a black box. We don't know. Is that?
I wouldn't bet my salary on the $2.1 billion.
Right, okay.
That's off memory. And the pure middleman is...
Well, in this government, you get a bonus regardless of how good a job you do, so you don't have to worry about it. I'm just joking. But sir, the numbers here are I think quite striking, because we hear this narrative from the Liberals across who say, it's any cut, any reduction in spending is going to impact service delivery. But this clearly shows that there's waste within government, contracting out for things that we don't need to be contracting out. And I thank you for your time. Anything you want to follow up on that, I'd appreciate.
I'm going to go back, Monsieur Giroux, following a line of questioning my colleague had around the deficit spending. This year's spending has increased to $493.7 billion, which is an increase of $50.4 billion. You state in your economic outlook that the deficit is projected to resume its downward trajectory if there are no new measures and existing measures sunset. But as I indicated in my first round, this is not consistent with the government's spending patterns. Based on this government's record and the fact that new measures are already being introduced, do you expect this to be accurate? So my colleague had asked you, what is the area of spending which is of most concerning to you? Do you believe that the deficit projected to resume its downward trajectory is possible, is accurate based upon your comments?
When we release our economic and fiscal outlook and we project the deficit going forward, it's assuming no new fiscal measures, because that would be very difficult to include potential measures. What would we include and how much new spending or tax measures would we assume to be introduced? So that's why these are status quo based on what we know at the time that we put this one to bed, the economic and fiscal outlook. However, what we have seen in the past is whenever the government tables a budget or a fall statement, the track for spending tends to go upwards, which is a policy choice. So am I certain that the fiscal track we released in the fiscal outlook will be the one that materializes? I don't think it will happen, because the government will introduce new measures, which is why governments get elected. But
historically, we'll change that as the Conservative government. But
the government has also indicated that, or the Minister of Finance rather, indicated that she wants the deficit in 26-27 to be at most 1% of GDP. And by our estimate, status quo would suggest it will be at 0.8% of GDP. So that suggests there's not that much room for maneuvering in that fiscal year if the government wants to maintain 1%. The deficit at 1% of GDP in 2026-27 without increasing taxes.
Right. And of course, we're looking at the implementation of lofty programs such as the dental program, the proposed pharmacare on which the current government's power hinges, and of course, the failed child care system which they've tried to implement. Going back to my colleague, Mr. Genis's comments about the IT middlemen, we know that there's been a reduction of 49 full-time equivalents in the procurement department at a time when we are trying to eliminate the middlemen due to the incredible bloated costs we see with the Arrive scam scandal. But these 49 positions are a result of these positions not being filled when they become vacant. Is this a trend that's occurring in other departments and agencies as well that you're seeing?
No. So I'm not aware of that particular instance of a reduction in FTEs. But what we've seen over time is that the number of FTEs has in fact increased. And personnel spending has also increased. So there are obviously isolated cases of reductions in FTEs in specific programs or sectors, but overall the size of the public service has consistently increased over time.
Right, and to that point, spending on public service personnel has increased to $67.4 billion, which is up from the $63.3 billion spent last year. Are you aware if that increase is due to staffing levels or to salary increases?
It's a combination of both an increase in the number of FTEs. And last numbers I saw, there was an increase of, I think, 18,000 to 438,000 FTEs in the public service, but also an increase in salary or remuneration costs per FTE. And the last number I saw was 125,000 and a few $100 in personnel costs per employee.
This government obviously saw the pandemic as an opportunity to shovel money to their friends. We saw this with the multiple ethics breaches by members of this government for giving contracts to liberal insiders and personal friends. And while the government may say that all the spending was justified and necessary due to the pandemic, your own office stated that $204.5 billion, roughly 36% in spending from March 2020 to April 2022 was not pandemic related. And despite all this extra spending, or maybe because of all the extra spending, Canadians are worse off. All we need to do is look at the example of the Arrive Can scam and your own observations or concerns in response to a question I asked today regarding the increase in spending versus the performance of the public service. My question to you would be, how will the cost of the increased debt that we have incurred as a result of this wasteful spending affect the government's ability to deliver services moving forward?
So it's an interesting question in the sense that it's something that the government has to pay, that we have to pay regardless of future decisions, because the debt is the debt and we have to pay interest on it. So we can look at what would have happened had we not seen an increase in debt, or what would have happened in the absence of increases in interest rates. And a simple way to look at that is to assume what would happen without the increase in debt servicing costs. And the simple answer is that it's money that could have been spent on other things, or for example, reducing taxes, or spent on other proposals. But that's a highly hypothetical scenario because we don't know exactly what would have happened in the absence of this additional debt servicing costs, because that would have meant decisions that would have led us in a different track, obviously.
So I'll ask the question a little bit differently. Should the debt carrying costs have an impact on planned spending for the upcoming year?
They will undoubtedly have an impact, because the moment you have to provide or use some of your more of your revenues towards servicing the debt, it means lower spending on other things, other priorities, other things being equal, of course.
In your report, you mention in that the estimates include a $1.4 billion acquisition of shares in the Canada Growth Fund. And I'm sure Canadians would appreciate understanding what this Canada Growth Fund means and a $1.4 billion acquisition of shares. Is this $1.4 billion in addition to the $15 billion that was earmarked for this fund, or is it simply a part of it?
My understanding is that it is a part of it, but it's not something that we have done a report on. But my understanding at this point is that it's one part. It's part of the $15 billion.
Are you aware if this new Canada Growth Fund is going to be set up in a similar way to the Green Slush Fund?
I'm not aware of the governance issues around the Canada Growth Fund. Not yet.
Okay, thank you. Another question I have for you is in the Department of Public Works and Government Services estimates, there is a line, Vote 1C, funding for a cybersecurity certification program for defense contracts. That was in budget 2023 at $798,000. Can you tell me, is this for defense contractors that are employed by the government?
I don't know exactly the details of this item.
It's a bit of an interesting question given the witness we had here at committee last week, who was the chief security officer for a company that was contracted by the government who it would appear did no real work when it came to those security assessments. And so I'd be really interested to know if we're funding individuals within the public service or if this is supposed to help those external consultants actually check off a box when they're looking to procure contracts with the government.
I think that's a question that would be better answered by the Deputy Minister at PSPC or the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I was hoping that we could have a discussion about the looming carbon tax hike that the Prime Minister is planning for April 1st. You did a comprehensive study of the carbon tax, and but you not only looked at the direct cost, you looked at the total cost. On page 3 of the report, it says household net cost of the federal fuel charge, fiscal and economic impacts. I'm sure there's lots of Canadians that are following this very closely because they know how high prices are and they're afraid of how high they're going to jump April 1st. But can you just explain what that means, fiscal and economic impacts?
So the fiscal impact is the impact of paying the tax directly, for example, filling up the gas tank, gas to heat the home. The indirect costs, so for example, if you buy a service or goods, there's an energy component embedded, plus the GST that's applied to that tax. So that's the fiscal cost. The government sends a check or a rebate. So the fiscal impact is the difference between what you pay, indirect and direct, minus the rebate. And on that front, 80%, we estimate 80% of households get more than what they pay. When we also include the economic impacts, that's taking into account the fact that some sectors will be negatively affected by the carbon tax. For example, the transportation sector, the oil and gas sector is an obvious example. They'll be presumably negatively affected by a carbon tax that progressively increases. So when we take also that into account, we find that households will have lower employment in some sectors, lower investment income, and we find that it's the opposite. Once you take into account the fiscal and economic impact, the changes in the economic fabric of the country, that households are seeing a negative impact from the carbon tax when including both the amounts that they pay, but also the economic impact on households.
So in other words, the fiscal impacts are where the tax is applied directly. So when I see that on my fuel bill, when I fill up my car, if I see that on my heating bill, that's the direct cost. And the rebate was only built around capturing that cost. But what you're saying today is that all the other cascading effects of the carbon tax increase will have a cost to Canadians.
Yes, there's an adjustment in the economy that's expected to take place by reducing our use of fossil fuels, and that will have impacts, certainly in the short term, while the economy adjusts, and that increases costs, for example, of transportation companies, which presumably will have lower profits that they will redistribute less of to shareholders, for example.
And higher costs that get passed on to consumers. So that's a factor too in the economic cost too. It's the indirect kind of cascading effects as a trucker has to pay his share of the carbon tax. That has to be accounted for somewhere. So with either higher prices, as you say, either lower wages or lower profits back to shareholders. Okay, and with that in mind, the majority of Canadians are the majority of Canadians better off or worse off even after you factor in the rebate?
Well, once you factor in the rebate, but also the economic impacts, based on our modeling, the majority of households will see a negative impact as a result of the carbon tax.
Okay. And you've broken down in this chart what are called quintiles. But for those that might not be familiar with that word, that basically means you take incomes and you divide them into 5 groups from highest to lowest. Is that right?
So from the highest is quintile 1, and the highest, we can call them MPs, but we call them quintile 5. That's a joke.
And I'm looking at this chart, and even the third, like the middle quintile, the third quintile, is a net loser in the province. I'm just looking at Alberta is even after you factor in the rebate. The net cost is in that middle quintile, that middle income earner, is $1,460 worse off. It's about little over $100 a month. Saskatchewan, my home province, $929 worse off even after the rebate. Manitoba, $1,000 worse off even after the rebate. Ontario, $1,200. Nova Scotia, $1,100 worse off even after the rebate. Prince Edward Island, $1,118. Newfoundland and Labrador, $680. In most of these cases, we're talking about an extra $100 a month in costs, even after the rebate. Am I reading that correctly?
These are averages, of course, and it varies across provinces depending on the exact or the particular economic conditions and industrial structure of each province and jurisdiction.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That is our time. Ms. Sowen, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Giroux, just following up with this kind of line of questioning, some of the numbers that you quoted, does this include any costs associated with, say, environmental damages, forest fires, impacts to the agricultural sector for shorter growing seasons, for example, or droughts or floods? Are there costs associated with that are captured in those numbers you just suggested?
No, because they're very difficult to estimate in the short term, and we've made that point quite often, but it's very difficult to determine which part of forest fires or natural disasters are due to climate change and which ones would occur normally anyways. So it's very difficult to determine these aspects, and they're unfortunately not included. We have tried, however, to estimate the cost of climate change over a longer period of time in another report, and this report is available, but it's very difficult to determine the impact in the short term of climate change. So what we have done is a horizon between now and 2030 for the carbon tax. It would be very difficult to determine the cost of climate change over such a short period of time.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Giroux, you testified earlier that over $21 billion is being spent by this government, or over $20 billion is being spent on contracting out. Of that, your estimate was that about 10%, over $2 billion, is being spent on management consulting, and you're not able to identify, based on the available figures, how much is being spent on middleman. We've tried to dig into this in other places, other committees. We've been able to identify that there are 635 staff augmentation firms, companies that they don't actually perform IT work. They're IT staff augmentation firms. They receive contracts and subcontract. The government was not able to provide information about numbers of employees at those companies. So, in how many cases were they, like GC Strategies, simply companies of 2 people or less? Do you have any work going on? Do you have any ability to identify across over 600 companies how much money we're talking, just in terms of paying? This is just IT work, paying middlemen for IT work, and there are likely many other cases where we're paying middlemen. Do you have any work going on, or any ability to see into how much money the government is spending on this contracting to contracting multi-layered process?
No, it's not something that we are currently looking at, and I think it would be more within the bailiwick of the Auditor General.